are listening to Inside Voices on WNHHLP 103.5 FM.
Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone, wherever you are listening. Thank you for joining us for Inside Voices. My name is Georgia Goburn, and I am the Executive Director of Hope for New Haven, as well as the co-founder of Circle. I always say I am pleased, and I genuinely mean that. I am pleased to be joined today by Dan Barrett, who is and I'm going to get your title right, the legal director of the ACLU of Connecticut. Welcome, Dan.
Why, thanks. It's so good to be here.
Yes. We always give our host just a few minutes to introduce themselves and just to give a little bit background about who you are and the work that you do.
Sure. So, as you said, I'm the legal director of the ACLU of Connecticut, based in Hartford, but we cover the whole state, and we litigate and move things in the state house and in the minds of the public throughout the state to extend and embrace our civil liberties throughout Connecticut. And so for us, early childhood education touches on a lot of different areas. Racial equity, and these days, sadly, immigration plays a role in that discussion. So I'm very happy to be here talking with you today.
And I'm happy to have you, Dan, because I have to be honest, I was witnessed, and I know we talked about this before, we witnessed that story that occurred in Chicago where ICE, the Immigration and Custom Enforcement folks, went into a daycare and took a teacher out, a preschool teacher out in front of parents, in front of children, and while she was screaming and trying to communicate that she has her papers and she wanted to share that with them, to no avail. And the reason why, we want to really have this conversation is because we are all immersed in the or just immersed in the stories of these ICE raids. We have a student in at Wilbur Cross who himself was like, in wrapped up in an ICE raid here. We've heard about several ICE raids that are occurring in Connecticut. And I know for our community in the early care realm, we have had these questions, and we have asked our state agency, Office of Early Childhood, to give guidance on what we are supposed to do if we are ourselves faced with the situation that happened in Chicago. And so that's the reason for this conversation. And obviously we're going to talk about that as it relates to children, but we're going to talk more broadly about what the impact has been on children and families in the state. So I guess the first question I would like to start with is, have the ACLU seen an increase in calls that are coming into your agency to respond to some of these ICE raids?
Nationally, yes, we are hearing every day about these, and in other parts of the country, there's a lot of litigation going on by the ACLU and sometimes by other groups and by states about these raids, because I think, as you have alluded to, any sense of decency is gone with the current government. And so we have people being grabbed up, in front of their children, people being grabbed up because of where they work, and other very crude suspicions, the color of their skin, the language that they speak, the accent that they have. So
Mhm.
across the nation, we are very busy with this. In Connecticut, of course, we've had, in New Haven, there was a mom taken right in front of her kids. There was the young man from Wilbur Cross. There was a raid over in Hamden at the car wash. So these things are kind of omnipresent these days.
One of the things that we have been disabused of is that there are no areas that ICE will not enter. And you mentioned the story of a mom that was removed in front of her children. And we've seen a lot of these stories on YouTube and on the news. And we see these clips and they're just like little clips that just show a moment in time, and we can guess what happens afterwards with that parent or that adult. But what if that parent is with a child? What are some of the stories that you've been hearing about what happens to these children when ICE remove parents or our caretakers or guardians from a particular location, and the children are there?
Yeah, that's an area of severe concern, especially for mixed status families where the child is a natural born US citizen and the parent, maybe arguably does not have status, or the government incorrectly thinks that they don't have status. So we're very worried about that. In New Haven, there was a mom who was taken in the hill from a car containing her kids, which could have been a very, very bad situation.
Mhm.
My understanding is that there was a relative nearby or in the house who was able to take the children to school, provide for the children, that kind of stuff. But that's a severe concern because an unattended child who has no parent is going to fall into the arms of the state, which is in itself quite a harm that we'd like to avoid. And then there's a secondary issue of a child not knowing where their parent is. ICE is holding a lot of people incommunicado these days. It seems to be intentionally moving people around the country to make it more difficult for family members to find them or for them to file an action that would get them access to judicial review. So it can be dangerous and bewildering. Family separation is just awful at either the local level or further out as the movie kind of unfurls. But I am very concerned about the fact, for example, in New Haven, that ICE thought it was appropriate to take a parent from children and simply leave the children where they were without any regard for what happened to them. That's difficult to describe.
So do you know what happened to those children for that mom in the hill? Well,
Well, the
said there was
reading,
a relative there.
yeah, reading for the coverage in the Independent had it that there was a relative who was nearby, but that seemed to me to be chance. And I often think about that in my own life and anyone else where you think you have two working parents, it's reasonably common that one parent has to be at work at this time and the other parent's going to do drop off, take the kid to school, whatever it is. So you could easily run into a situation in which there is no parent around, and if you don't live in the same town as your relatives, so your 12-year-old child is just going to be alone. It's staggering and it's very dangerous.
So when these families are taken up, you said that they're moved around in different places. We have heard the border czar, Tom Homan, say, well, parents can well, families don't have to be separated. The children can go with them. But there's a logistical reality that if people are being taken and family members cannot get reconnected with them, then obviously there's no opportunity for families to be reconnected and to self deport, as they suggest. So, what happens? What are you hearing about what happened to those children within those families? How are they reconnected if the families really don't know where they are?
Yeah, that's both a short-term and a long-term problem. The short-term problem is that anyone who's picked up inside of Connecticut is not going to stay in Connecticut. They're going to be taken to a number of places on the East Coast. There's a facility in Maine, there's a facility in New York, there's a couple of county jails in Massachusetts, there's a county jail in New Hampshire. So right away off the bat, you're dealing with geographic distance. And this problem of not knowing where the person is widespread and it doesn't seem accidental. So you have this immediate panic of where is my parent? And then even if there are other relatives who can step in and provide care for the child, there's still, I mean, can you fathom trying to explain to your child that nobody knows where dad is right now?
Yeah.
I mean, it's unbelievable. For the longer term, the government's idea that a child, particularly a U.S. citizen child, can simply leave the country and go somewhere else, ignores a couple of things. Number one, the child has a right to be here, just like you and I do, and grow up in America if they want to. The second is that for children who came here young or were born here, they have no real connection to any other country. Just as, my parents moved around when I was growing up for economic reasons, so did theirs. And they didn't have any hand in it. And it's just not only cruel, but also sort of deliberately obtuse to say, oh, no big deal. The child can just uproot their whole life, drop out of the New Haven schools and go somewhere else, some country where they may not even speak the language. It's ignoring the main issue, which is the families are being separated, and it seems to be a tool of punishment and control.
Yeah. And when we talk about using that as a tool of punishment and control, it also ignores the long-term impact that it has on the children, psychological growth and development, and the long-term, adverse childhood experience. These compounded adverse childhood experiences, certainly, we know in the early care realm, have longer-term impact on children's growth and development.
Yes, I
Um,
think it's a species of what we've seen and what I think as a society we've talked more and more about over the last few years. For example, with when DCF comes in and removes a parent or interrupts the parent-child relationship, when prison, when a hospitalization, those kinds of effects, as you say, can be very long running. And here the government can be creating problems that will blossom over the years, and it's completely unnecessary.
Yeah. So you mentioned that there's been certainly a lot more increase outreach to your agency nationwide, but not so much in Connecticut. So can you talk about what may be some of the barriers that you are seeing for folks to reach out to folks in Connecticut? Is it specific to Connecticut, or is it just stories that you're hearing possibly at statewide level?
Oh yeah, no, there's plenty of stuff going on. There's plenty of outreach. My limited view, because I run the litigation at the ACLU of Connecticut, um, I am looking for cases to litigate in which we're going to attack the way in which ICE is grabbing people, the place that they're grabbing people. They're getting in the way of things like people being able to attend court proceedings. And in that context, it can be tough to find somebody who actually wants to file a lawsuit for very understandable reasons.
Hmm.
They've got a lot going on, and they may come from a culture in which it's the worst decision possible in their minds to sue the government. So I understand that. That doesn't mean there isn't a lot of other stuff going on. In particular, at the State House, there's been a lot of very good advocacy and a lot of education going on to make sure lawmakers know how this stuff affects Connecticut residents and Connecticut families. And that's why, for example, we have had multiple updates to the Trust Act, including a measure last week at the special session, which would affect the way that ICE can detain people at our state courthouses. So
So can
there's a
you
lot
talk
going
about what
on.
the Trust Act is?
Yes, the Trust Act is a Connecticut law that embodies the state policy of non-cooperation with ICE. And by non-cooperation, I don't mean in the sort of, we're talking about early childhood education. So when you think about cooperation, it means one thing when my kid is not being cooperative. But in our system of government, the federal government is responsible for some things, the state government is responsible for everything else. Immigration is a purely federal area of law. The states have no control over it. And
Mm.
what Connecticut has done is to say, okay, that's the way the Constitution sets it out. This is all your responsibility, and we're not going to help you. That is to say, you must pay for it. You must provide the personnel. What Connecticut won't do is, for example, allow its local police to be deputized and become sort of junior ICE agents because we've decided that that's not the way we want to operate our state. That law has been in place for quite some time, but over the years, there have been certain adjustments that need to be made. And then the state court system made some internal policy changes, and eventually that became a statute when, after January, ICE became more and more aggressive, actually in courthouses. And we had people being grabbed, almost like the daycare example you gave, a setting in which we expect people to be able to come and have their disputes adjudicated in a civil manner. And we had a scene in one courthouse in which ICE chased a man through the courthouse and pepper sprayed him in a court, in the courthouse. And the judges were rightfully, I think, quite angry about it. So we've made changes to our state law to prevent that from happening. And it's a way to try to continue to make Connecticut a society that functions. The last thing that the court system wants is for people who have business in the court to not want to turn to the court for help. And, for example, for people who are witnesses in criminal cases to want to stay away and just stay silent. Everything starts to break down if that happens. So on a state level, we've made it very clear we're not interested. This is the feds doing their own thing. We're not going to assist this in any way.
So, you talked about at the state level and what legislators are doing, and one of the things that really struck me this year was our dear friend and legislative champion Corey Parrish, um, you know, shared with his constituents that ICE was in the area and he was threatened by the Trump administration, and they were suggesting that there may be actions taken towards him. So, if they feel as emboldened to threaten legislators, then what can, daycare directors, owners, teachers, what kind of protection can we reasonably expect to protect, our parents and our children from ICE and the Trump administration?
Big question. And I think the answer is on a couple of different levels. There's an operational level, which I'm quite sure daycares and early childhood education centers and schools have probably implemented, sadly, as a result of other developments. Basically, we want to keep strangers from coming into these facilities just generally. Um, but ICE is now in the role where they kind of fall into that bucket of a stranger you do not want to let just wander into the facility. And so I think the most appropriate thing is to have a protocol in place and to just make ICE follow the law. What ICE trades on is giving the impression that it has the authority to give itself the ability to enter private property and look for people. So it will issue itself these administrative warrants that are signed by ICE employees, not by a judge. Show up and wave it and make it look very professional, but the reality is they do not have a search warrant. They're not allowed to come in. So I think I would deal with them as any other government agency and just hold them account to what the law is. So probably the Office of Early Childhood Development has given guidelines, and the ACLU has published them. And it boils down to making clear what's public and private space at a facility, to the extent one has not already done that. Checking everyone who comes in and out. You can't just come into a school. You can't just walk into a daycare. And having a point person whose job it is to deal with ICE if ICE shows up. And that includes knowing how to read the paper that they present as a warrant and figure out whether it's an actual judicial warrant signed by a judge or this internal permission slip that doesn't actually give them the ability to come into the facility. Having that person, the point person who you can always call, who's been trained, they can come down and actually figure out, okay, is this the real deal? Do we have to let them in or not? I think that helps.
So I'm thinking about all the stuff that we have to do as childcare providers. We went to college for education, not for law. And of course, there is interlapping issues with the law and with childcare that actually occurs. And sometimes we are kind of stuck in the middle with these things. So you mentioned that, we should be trained in how to recognize a valid warrant. So where would we go and get access to those resources? Does the ACLU do anything around those types of support?
Yeah, so we have published information about how to sort the sheep from the goats when it comes to looking at a warrant. We're certainly happy to provide more information. I think there's other groups in Connecticut that have done those sorts of trainings and are really we are very blessed here in Connecticut. We have a very active constellation of groups that are advocating for the rights of families and for immigrants. And so that stuff is reasonably easy to find. I think that really what it boils down to when it comes to the warrant is that you want the ICE person to identify, that is, flip to the page and show you the name of the judge who signed the warrant. And if the answer is, well, no judge signed this warrant, I'm sorry, you can't come in. That is your right under the Constitution. That you just can't come in. It's the same way that you might treat someone, for example, sadly, I'm sure this comes up, an aggravated parent who shows up and says, I'm on pickup today, but for example, that there's an order of protection or there's some other thing in place that means this guy doesn't get in. It's the same thing with ICE. You're just going to be polite but firm and say, I'm sorry, you don't have a warrant, you're not coming in.
And we've had some instances with state agencies, that so sometimes we have like a DCF person who will show up that's not on the list for us, and we will tell them, unfortunately, you can't come and pick up the child because, we don't have authorization to do that. And for the most part, DCF understands and work within the system to say, okay, let me get my supervisor who is the supervisor for this, caseworker, and then we resolve some of these issues on the phone. But based on what we're seeing on television and on YouTube, it doesn't appear that ICE agents are inclined to basically ensure that the public is aware of, you know, what is, what our rights are, and what, just how far they can go in terms of gaining access to private spaces. So if you have somebody that is, in a very heated um, exercise state, and they feel particularly offended by you basically saying, no, you can't come in, and then they decide to barge themselves in anyway, what recourse do you have in a childcare center setting when that occurs?
It's a lot like when dealing with the police. I mean, and I realize I'm also speaking as a white person. So the story that I'm telling you in the law is not necessarily the same for a black and brown person in Connecticut. And I don't mean to sound like, oh, everything's perfect. Don't worry, there's the law. I understand that they're two different things. So I think that practically speaking, if it gets to the point where there's an angry government employee, perhaps threatening to use physical force or actually doing that, this is not the time to physically fight back to try to stop them. As long as you're quite sure that it's actually ICE. P.S. That's a whole different problem that ICE has brought upon itself by dressing in the way they do, by covering their faces. Who are these guys? We don't really know. But if you're reason to come for that it is actually ICE and they're physically trying, they're assaulting staff or they're trying to get in, I mean, it is not the time to fight them. We can try to get some recompense later for the way that they're behaving, especially if they're coming in without a warrant. But you raise a very good issue, which is this government. I think you started by asking about the legislator that they threatened.
Mm-hmm.
This government doesn't want people to know their rights, although it has a lot of rhetoric about the Constitution and about, taking America back for our principles. It's not actually that big in allowing people to know their rights and exercise them. And so we're left in the tough position of having to learn ahead of time what our rights are and then stand firm or as firm as we can in the situation and go from there. But they are awfully good at giving the impression that there's something wrong with knowing the limits on what the government can do.
So one of the, we are blessed and privileged in New Haven that we have, a very multiracial, multi-ethnic, multicultural, multilingual community, right? And based on a Supreme Court ruling several months ago, it appears that they are suggesting that by virtue of you speaking a language that is not English, or being in a certain place where they perceive that immigrants, possibly immigrants without status, will be, that they have now been given the right to stop. And we've heard these stories, right? And to stop and to question anybody that they perceive um, to um, to not have legal status in this country. Can you clarify? Because I want to be clear. So is that a law that basically says that it's okay to do that for the Hispanic community, or is that a law that basically, or a ruling that could impact any single person, even though we have a perception that ICE is really targeting Black and brown people?
I think it's the latter. So strictly speaking, I mean, it's a level of technicality that, only a lawyer could love, but it's very dangerous for everyone. So what you're describing is an action that the US Supreme Court took in response to some litigation that my colleagues in Southern California brought against ICE doing sweeps and raids in which they would grab up people who they thought don't look like Americans, which really just means weren't white,
Mm-hmm.
or who were speaking Spanish, or who spoke English with an accent, or who were working jobs that ICE agents thought are typically worked by immigrants, and particularly those without status. They obtained a preliminary injunction to prevent ICE from using things like a person's skin color as an indicator of lawful status. And the US Supreme Court put a hold on the preliminary injunction, effectively allowing the government to continue doing what it was doing. And that is the most worrisome part for all of us because it will allow ICE to make these, in many cases, just outright racist assumptions about who they're looking at and therefore whether the person is lawful and detain people based on the surface level only and the worst case, which is detaining people based on their race. So it's an extremely worrisome decision. I think it's likely to be one that goes down in history as one that gets derided and is a shameful chapter
We would
in the
hope,
Supreme
Tim.
Court.
We would hope because again, the victor writes the history, right?
Yeah, it's maybe this is the human condition. We're doomed to kind of repeat the mistakes of the past, but the U.S. Supreme Court doesn't have a great track record in this regard. And
Mhm.
for example, in the 1940s, they okayed rounding up American citizens of Japanese descent and holding them in internment camps. And we now look back on that and say, what in the world were you thinking? And yet, this year, our Supreme Court did something that's very close to that. So it's a worrisome development. And I think that what we can do a couple of things. Number one, we can continue to make clear that here in Connecticut, on the state and local level, we have an expectation about the way that life should be led and the way that our society is structured. Connecticut, as you well know, has made huge investments and a real long-term commitment to early childhood education and development, groundbreaking this past year.
Mhm.
We have said immigration is the federal government's problem. It's the federal government's area, and we're not going to be involved in it. We have made commitments to public education. We have laws that protect a number of our fundamental attributes and prevent discrimination. We have to make sure that we stay that course, and we're going to be under increasing pressure, especially because of federal funds, to begin discriminating on the basis of things that we would never use in the past, like immigration status for entry into the public schools. We just have to make sure that we have to gut it out and say, we've embarked on the right course here in Connecticut, and we're going to stay doing that because a vibrant and multicultural society is what we are lucky to have and what we should be responsible for keeping.
So you mentioned the limits of the state on these federal policies in action, right? Um, and I'm going back to the question about an ICE agent feeling very entitled to pretty much barge their way into a center, which is what they did in Chicago. I mean, they just went right into that center and snatched that teacher out of the classroom in full view of the parents and the children. And that center, again, is a private property, right? And again, we don't know, I don't know if what the disposition of that situation was, but I'm thinking about for our programs, and we are thankfully in a city where I think, the local leaders are very well, on the side of protecting our community and our legislators as well. So if again somebody we were to find ourselves in that situation or any childcare provider finds himself in that situation, what legal recourse do we have as private business owners to take action against ICE?
Well, in theory, you have the ability to sue any employee, such as you've described, who barges in without a warrant, who hurts people, who breaks, some of the daycare's facilities or property, who traumatizes children. I think the reality is those suits are getting harder and harder to mount, which is a real threat to democratic control of the government. But that possibility is there, and we at the ACLU are looking to do those kinds of lawsuits. We need the most basic check on our government employees from state and local all the way up to the feds
Mhm.
to make sure that they follow the foundational rule that's set out in the Fourth Amendment. You can't do that. You can't just barge in and grab children. So that is something that you would have to litigate down the line. That's something that we would be looking to do.
So, what are the different types? Are you looking to pursue class action cases, or are you looking to advocate on behalf of individuals? What is the strategy that the ACLU is looking to do in light of this?
It depends on the issue. Some issues are better suited to class actions, and some issues are better suited to individual cases.
Mhm.
When it comes to ICE misconduct, abuse, violation of the law, things like that. Those are usually individual cases, depending on how the facts work out, but we'd love to hear about them.
Mhm.
There are bigger fact patterns throughout the US that you'll see the ACLU engaging on. For example, holding people incommunicado, these things that are broad patterns and practices of
Okay.
the government. So it's kind of all of that we want to hear about and we're interested in pursuing. I think it's also important that our lawmakers in Connecticut hear about these things as they have been from so many of our good um, pro-immigration groups
Mhm.
and do what they can to structure Connecticut law appropriately. For example, we could create a Connecticut um, method of filing lawsuits against federal employees who violate the national constitution. That's something we could do under state law and have not done
Mhm.
yet. We could also make really clear, for example, the governor could enact an executive order making clear that Connecticut is not going to provide any material support for a National Guard invasion by the feds, or as we saw in Charlotte, effectively an invasion by ICE, where they take over the streets. We can say as a state that we're not going to give them so much as free parking. They cannot stage their stuff in state parking lots. They cannot use state buildings. They cannot use state employees. Nothing. You're on your own. Those kinds of things are small measures that add up to a lot, and we could pursue those here.
So you mentioned that the state could actually pursue have legal recourse, and that's something that hasn't been pursued. Is there a reason why that states haven't done more to pursue those pathways?
Well, when it comes to recourse for let's say an individualized situation in which a federal employee breaks the law, the state could create effectively a class of, it would enact a statute that creates what we call a cause of action, allowing a person to sue the federal employee who violated the federal constitution. There
Mm-hmm.
is some interest in doing that in Connecticut, and I think you'll hear more from us about doing that, but it requires a little bit of work on the part of the legislature.
Mm-hmm.
States have been active, including Connecticut, in, for example, contesting the National Guard invading a city or um, ICE coming in and doing certain things. They've tried to head those things off. So the states have been active, but there is a role for state legislatures to provide us lawyers with the ability to go into court and get recompense for somebody whose rights were violated.
So, um, so for childcare centers, one of the things that we have been advised and guided by the OEC to do again is to look at those to look at the court order, and yeah, I guess we're going to have to be trained in how to recognize an appropriate subpoena. And one of the guidance, because they were doing the guidance in the form of a question and answer, and one of the guidance that it gave was and I'm pretty sure this was based on a question that was asked, if I'm a family childcare provider and ICE comes in to my program and then takes me away. And we know how they pretty much traffic people through different facilities and make sure that we cannot communicate. The question is, well, what do you do with those children that are there? And again, going back to, have you heard stories of that actually happening, or where ICE is actually creating space for that person to secure those children? Because that was the guidance. Make sure you contact parents and secure the children. But I'm thinking, if ICE is just snatching you up and taking you away, and if they have general disregard for children that are in a car, you would hope that their humanity would want to make sure that we're securing babies, but again, from what we've seen, we cannot always trust that a person is going to do that. So, what advice would you give to a provider? Because I imagine if there's kind of in that position, that creates a lot of legal liability for them, even as childcare operators. So, what advice would you give to the industry for us to think about in those scenarios?
Well, I think if you're describing, for example, someone who works alone, maybe in their own home, providing, I can't remember what the ceiling
Family
is.
childcare,
And
yeah,
it's what,
there.
2 kids or 6 kids or something. There's some limit on
So
it.
6 to 9 children.
Okay. I think if I were operating alone and I had concerns that ICE would mistake me for or make an argument that I was fair game for detention, I might think about a system in which I checked in with somebody periodically during the day if I really
Mhm.
thought that I was in danger, such that if someone did not get a phone call from me at lunchtime, they might stop by and make sure that everything's okay.
Mhm.
That might be one way to do it. I don't know that if you're grabbed up by the national government, you're going to face a whole lot of, as a matter of practicality, liability, because leaving the children was really not your choice. It was
Yeah.
forced upon you. But I make that suggestion in part. This is sad that we even have to talk about this, but some of our clients, we represent foreign students in Connecticut, foreign
Mhm.
university and college students who in the spring had to work out exactly that kind of a thing because the government unlawfully took away their status as foreign students and told them that the government was going to go and try to find them.
Yeah.
These are students who were completely above board, they had status, and then overnight, for reasons that were unlawful, the government withdrew it. And so what a number of them did was just that, the sort of buddy system where they would say, look, I, I'm a graduate student, I'm walking to my lab. I'm going to be at my lab from X to Y. I'll call you when I get home. If you don't hear from me by this hour, come over and make sure that I'm okay. So something like that could work. Although, again, I feel ridiculous even discussing it because we shouldn't live in a world in which people have to worry about being A, grabbed up, and B, in a situation where the government knows that the person is responsible for children and takes them away anyway. It would have been unthinkable before January, but here we are.
Yeah. One of the question on the Q&A and the guidance for early childhood provider was, well, if I'm taken away and have I'm not able to come back and to communicate and to operate my center for several months, you know, what would be the recourse from the state towards my program? Because again, we have regulatory requirements for the state to have access to our program and to communicate. And I wasn't quite happy with the guidance. They were kind of suggesting, well, you are subjected to these regulatory requirements. So again, you talked about the limitation of legal liability if a government takes you. Would that extend to the state as well? In the OEC, as I do, you know, they work with us in partnership. They really do. And I can't imagine that this would be a policy at the state that we're going to cite programs for that. But in the event that there is a rogue agent that decides to take some sort of action, what recourse do you have as a provider in those situations?
Yeah, I mean, assuming that, again, this assumes that the person has access, at some point can contact friends and family and maybe counsel. I think that the state is likely to understand that if you're grabbed up, you're not really in a position to fulfill whatever regulatory duties are
Mhm.
upon you. But it does raise the subject that is true both of small business operators and of parents generally in this environment, which is you have to do a little bit of planning for the worst. And I'm extrapolating because we've been talking about parents, and especially if you are a parent and you're in a situation in which the government you think the government could either make the argument that you're not here lawfully, or you have a pending proceeding and you're worried that you might get grabbed up, there are arrangements that you may want to make ahead of time. For example, designating someone, doesn't have to be a relative, but someone who's going to be able to care for your child. If you want to Google the Red Folder Project, this is a project that helps folks get things in order so that if the unthinkable does happen, um, it's not the children don't go into DCF custody. There's no set of hearings to figure out whether grandma gets the kids. It's all written down. Here's what should happen if I should go missing. Um, for example, here's authority for my spouse to, sign checks from my bank account, all that kind of stuff that we think of. Um, Maybe if you're a little older, you may think of it as estate planning, the more grimmer aspects of our life. We're thinking of what happens if we die. But sadly, for parents in this environment who are in that situation, they may want to think about pre-planning. All right, if an emergency happens, what happens to the kids? Similar for an operator of a daycare facility or a family childcare, as you described, they may want to think seriously about, okay, game it out a little bit. What happens if I don't come home on Tuesday night because the government gets me? Is there a trusted friend who also operates a daycare, who knows the industry and knows the requirements, who could take over for the day, call parents, do the things that need to get done? I think a little bit of pre-planning can sometimes help.
Okay. And you mentioned that there are organizations that are out there that can help with some of this work. Are you able to mention some of the organizations that people can reach out to?
Yeah, I think for when I was talking about the Red Folder Project, it sounds like a cop out, but in today's day and age, just Google it. It's a concept that has been implemented at a number of levels. Sometimes local governments are participating, sometimes universities are participating. And so you might be able to find a very local contact that will walk you through this kind of eventuality planning. Now, for the specific requirements of a daycare facility, a school, something like that, I think that probably goes beyond the ken of the Red Folder Project, but within the industry, there might be somebody who's thought about this and can kind of walk you through what has to happen.
And what about for families? What are some organizations that you can mention that are doing this really pretty much God's work right now?
I think, it depends a little bit on where you are in Connecticut, which is why I think I would Google like Connecticut Red Folder Project and
Okay.
figure out where nearby you, because there's a number of nonprofits that are really working hard to get this information out there. A lot of it is on the web, and so it's very easy to kind of follow through. In fact, it's a lot of forms you can fill out on your own. You don't even need to like go anywhere or talk with anyone. And I might start there, figure out what you need to do to kind of prepare for the worst.
Yeah, and I think, you know, we have, and you know very well that I engage a lot in advocacy and early child education, but there's some things that are just not in our wheelhouse. And so we just can't even possibly think about it. So it's really very good to hear about the different organizations that are out there that can give us some practical advice and strategies on how to prepare. So we're getting ready to wrap up, Dan. We have a few minutes just to just kind of have you kind of share where you think this is going. I mean, we are in this administration for the next 4 years, so just I just want I know we can't always see into the future, but when we're doing strategies, it's gonna be built on where we think certain things are going. So where do you think this is going? Do you think this is something that's sustainable in the community? And I know that there's a lot of, activities around pushing back against ICE, but are you hopeful, I guess is my question, that this is
Yeah,
to change? shortly.
I mean, as much as one can say that they can be hopeful in today's environment, I guess there's a couple of answers to your question, and one of which is the thing that makes me hopeful is the amount of mutual aid that's happening now in Connecticut,
Mhm.
where people are helping each other, not with necessarily like legal questions, but logistical stuff. So, for example, there are networks within the state, and I'm sure this is true of every state, in which, you know, someone knows, hey, my neighbor got taken by ICE and he has two kids. They need to get to school. And a neighbor says, yeah, I'll do it. I'll drive them to school. No problem. Or I'll cook dinner on Tuesday night. You get Wednesday. You get Thursday. People are divvying up the work in a way that I think is illustrative of the fact that the best parts of America, the kindness that we tend to have towards one another, they never died. Even though right now the people in charge want to make it seem like cruelty is in vogue,
Mhm.
looking out for one another has never gone away, and I don't think is going to go away. And this experience illustrates that you can, there's only certain ideas that you can push from the top. You could say as many times as you want that we shouldn't pay attention to our neighbors and be involved in our community and care about what happens to our kids, even if we don't have kids.
Mhm.
But on the ground, you can't make that happen because people do care about that stuff. I also think it's galvanizing people to think very carefully about the role of the national government and what kind of future we want to have in America. And even if you don't care about immigrants, even if you don't care about the vitality of Connecticut's society, this experience has made a lot of people in that bucket, let's say, especially white people who wouldn't necessarily care about this issue, really stop and think. The government's position is so extreme. You remember this government claims that it can, at the stroke of a pen, tell people that they're no longer citizens, right? They decided, oh, the birthright citizenship is gone. I mean, it's in the Constitution. What this is making people think about, even if they're not directly, they don't care at all about their fellow humans or immigration, is, well, if this government thinks that it can delete birthright citizenship and do all of these other things, who's next and what is it going to look like? Because the rule of law has been thrown right out the window. And so I think that we're coming together and realizing that there are certain parts of the way that we organize our lives and the way that we organize our government that are not negotiable and we're not going to accept.
No, I'm so grateful that you brought that up, and I wish we had a little bit more time to discuss that, but I do want to kind of probe that a bit because it is so it, I've been having that conversation with my, inner circle about the danger of revoking birthright citizenship because this is a slippery slope towards then defining who then becomes an American. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it's just all white people. It could be a certain sect of white people. You have to be white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant to be considered an American, right? And if you don't fall into any of those buckets, then you can have your citizenship stripped from you. I know there are lots of African American I've heard on YouTube saying, well, they can't come for us. Well, they can if they say that if you are Black, you cannot be citizen of this country because we now have a new definition of of who becomes citizen. So I've had those conversations, Dan. So I'm so glad that you raised those slippery slopes in this law that people aren't who are actual citizens are actually not really thinking about. And because we've heard of citizens simply because of their race and their accents and where they are just being snatched up in these immigration raids as well.
Yeah,
So,
and the broader, we touched a little bit earlier about, race-based ICE enforcement.
mhm.
But that implicates race-based policing. I think even if you're a black or brown resident of Connecticut and you don't particularly care about immigrants, nonetheless, you should be really on edge because at sort of what comes next, because what the government is proposing is when it comes to figuring out who's here lawfully or not, we can judge you by the color of your skin. the accent, etc. Well, that doesn't end with immigrants. That's going to mushroom out into our entire society. And as you know, from our little state, you can easily run into people who were raised, their first language is Spanish. So they have an accent when they speak English, but they were born right here. If you were raised in a West Indian household, you might have a little lilt. You might have something that's, and suddenly you are in the position of having to explain to some cop or some ICE agent that no, actually you were born, at Yale, New Haven, and it's a nightmare, and there's no end to it. So immigration is the thin end of the wedge for, as you say, splitting apart the society and then making these white supremacist decisions about who gets to participate.
Well, I think that is a sobering note to end on, but I think it's an absolutely appropriate note to end on. So I'd just like to thank you once again, Dan Barrett, from the ACLU, for being here. Do you mind just sharing your contact information for anyone who wants to reach out to your agency?
Sure. Yeah. And thank you. I'm really impressed that you were looking at this from the lens of children and families, because they are obviously the never ending what's next for Connecticut. And so what we do to our kids is kind of be visited on us. So this is vital. If you want to ask us, if you're looking for legal help, you want to bring a situation to our attention, I think the best way is with our intake email address. It's just intake, INTAKE, at acluct.org. And our website is acluct.org. It's got a lot of good information on it, including some information for schools about, how to deal with ICE. So you could start there and go deeper if you want.
All right. Thank you so very much, Dan. I'm really grateful for your time and your wealth and breadth of knowledge.
Thank you so much.
You are listening to Inside Voices on WNHHLP 103.5 FM.